How many of you have ever been unemployed? How many of you are afraid of losing a job? And what if you have kids? What if your child can't find a job? Are you prepared for that? That's kind of the question. And why would that happen? At Rich Dad here, we often talk about the people that might be in the biggest trouble today, given this gap between the rich and everybody else. Everybody knows the poor are toast right now. Nobody's trying to save the poor anymore. They're trying to save the middle class. And I think the biggest dinosaur out there might be a middle class couple, making $120,000 a year, double income, dinks. Some of them have kids. And all of a sudden, one loses their job. Can they sustain their lifestyle if one gets fired? You see, what they're sitting on, Kim and I have met so many people say, well, I have a college degree, I have a master's degree. I said, yeah, but that was 20 years ago. That was 10 years ago. No, college-educated people will always be safe out here. And I really think those are the next dinosaur, the next low-hanging fruit to be picked off by this global economy. Any comments, Kim?
Well, I just see the employment picture is changing dramatically today. And you look at all these kids coming out of college, and a lot of them cannot find jobs. A lot of jobs don't require college degrees anymore. And what's important about this show is our expert today has a really important perspective on the future of jobs. And if you are working, if you have a job, you have kids who have jobs or future jobs, pay attention, because this is really going to be revolutionary.
So we've had him on before, is Martin Ford. His book is The Rise of Robots. And if I must confess, there's two things I must confess. One, I have a cold.
Only two?
Only two. One, I have a cold, so I may be coughing. I have a chest cold. I may be coughing every so often. And the second thing was when I first interviewed Martin, I hadn't read his book. Then all of a sudden I started to read his book, and I'm not a techie. I am as obsolete a Technosaurus Rex as they come. But when I read The Rise of Robots by Martin Ford, one of the, being an author, I tremendous respect for authors who are great writers. And Martin Ford conveys ideas so crystal clear that even a non-techie like me can get the big picture. And that's why I said to our producers, Tony and Melissa, we have to get Martin back on, because what he has to say, everybody should listen. So once again, for all of you, those out there with your college degrees and all that, thinking your job is safe and you'll never be unemployed, this is for you. So welcome to the program, Martin.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you say to people who think they have job security today? Let's say they're a middle manager and the wife is middle something and they making their $60K a year, combined income 120, 150, puts them in comfort zone. What does their future look like right now? What is happening in the world of technology?
Well, obviously we don't really know the future, but I think it's fair to say that almost no one has job security except maybe politicians. I think that technology is moving so fast and becoming so capable that really no matter what you're doing, there's some risk. But certainly if you are doing something that is on any level repetitive and routine, if there's any aspect of your job at all that's boring, where you feel you're kind of doing the same things again and again, that should be a warning to you right there that, technology might someday threaten that job. And the important thing to remember, it really doesn't matter so much what your education level. It doesn't matter whether you're doing a blue-collar type job where you're actually, working with your hands or manipulating the environment, as opposed to a white-collar job where you're dealing with information. I mean, all of those are susceptible. In many cases, the knowledge job, the job where you're just working with information and you don't have to actually do anything physically, that job in many cases may actually be easier to automate, because of course, to automate that job, then you only need software or artificial intelligence, right? It's something that can run on a regular computer. You don't need expensive robotic arms and things moving around and machines that might break down and all of that. So it can actually be easier to automate those types of work, and we're beginning to see that.
It could just be artificial intelligence via software, right? Not a robot.
That's right. I mean, sometimes we use the term robot very broadly to mean, any kind of automation, and we'll think in terms of software robots that don't actually do anything. But if you've got a desk job, then you obviously don't need a robot that moves around, right? You only need an algorithm, a software program, a machine learning application that can manipulate the information in the way you do, that can write a report or can make a decision, do an analysis. In many cases, that's a lot easier.
Yeah, I was in New York City at a hospital getting a checkup, and the radiologist, who was a very highly educated individual, he sat down 10 minutes, read my whatever he read, and it took him 10 minutes. He charged me $900 for that. And
it just demonstrated that there's just an article I saw today saying that artificial intelligence can now recognize skin cancer better than human doctors. So
you're
today
saying
will come when doctors aren't going to do that anymore, right? Because it'll be malpractice to allow a human doctor to do some things because the machines are going to be so much better at it. You wouldn't want any fallible human being looking at your potential cancer because they might make the mistake.
So you're not just
that kind of work is going to disappear.
You're not talking just about the repetitive lower end jobs. You're talking about doctors, radiologists,
accountants,
even
attorneys.
Lawyers. Correct?
That's right. I mean, a radiologist is a great example because it takes an incredible amount of training to become a radiologist. You've got to go to university, medical school. That's another 4 years. Then at least 5 years of residency after that. So, there aren't many professions that require more training than that, and yet that's a job that someday I think will be done entirely by computers.
And when you say someday, what is the time frame? I mean, some of this is already happening today, right?
It's already arriving. Like I said, there are already, in some instances, cases where machines are out computing people. So it may be the case that the computer is doing the work, but the doctor still has to be there because of regulation or maybe to offer a second opinion or something. But we're definitely moving toward the future where the doctor disappears entirely. And in other professions where there's less regulation than there is in medicine, where there's not a law that says, there has to be a person there, it's going to move a lot faster. So think in terms of lawyers that work in offices doing legal briefs or doing legal research or even journalists. I mean, there are systems that are writing news stories. I mean, a huge number of the stories that you read online or in newspapers are actually machine generated, and you can read them and it won't be obvious to you that they were written by a machine and not by a person.
I was shocked to read that in your book, The Rise of Robots, that even journalists are not, immune from unemployment. Doctors not immune, lawyers, accountants, a lot of repetitive work. So all these people say, well, I have a college degree, I have a profession and all that, I'm safe. You're the people I'm talking to today. Because if you've never been unemployed or if you feel you have job security, this is your program. Once again, it's the Rich Dad Radio Show, good news and bad news about money. Our guest is Martin Ford. He's the author of the fabulous book, The Rise of Robots. I suggest everybody read it because it'll open your eyes simply because you will see what most people cannot see coming towards them. In other words, you can't see the robot that's going to replace you right now. And Martin, I know you just saw in The Economist, they talk about the new manufacturing footprint. So doctors, lawyers, accountants, all the highly educated, the A students are no longer safe. But also McDonald's, they can replace 40% of their workers right now, which is the lower end of the spectrum. But just now in The Economist, they talked about how Adidas, the shoe manufacturer, is going to start manufacturing shoes in Germany and America, but not with humans, but with robots. So it means all the Chinese and Indians and Vietnamese, anybody who's doing repetitive manufacturing could also be in the crosshairs of technology. Is that correct?
That's right. And it's so it's something that's going to impact really across the world. It's not a problem just for the United States or just advanced countries. It's something that will impact developing countries. And in those countries, of course, they'll mostly be in factories because they really rely on those factory jobs. But those are going to disappear. Here in the United States, it'll be more service sector jobs because that's where everyone works now. And we really don't have too many people still working in manufacturing. But, of course, those jobs will disappear. So it's really going to be everywhere. What I say is that all of this artificial intelligence is kind of like what you'd call a real general-purpose technology. It's almost like electricity. And you wouldn't you would never say, well, what industries, what jobs are most impacted by electricity? Is kind of a stupid question because, I mean, it's everything, right? Everything relies on electricity, and the same is going to be true of artificial intelligence and robotics. It's just going to be everywhere. It's going to impact every type of work in every country in the world, in every industry. So we're looking at a huge disruption that's coming.
So even
really
when
to the whole world.
So even when President Trump on his whole campaign is all about bringing jobs back to America, can he bring jobs back to America given this rise of robots?
No, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it's possible. That's the thing. He's making a promise that he can't keep. He can't bring those manufacturing jobs back. He might bring the factories back, but then the factories will be there and they'll be running without any employees. And in fact, if you look at the one deal he made with Carrier, the company, what they did is they made a huge investment in their factory, and that investment is going toward automation. So there are actually going to be less, jobs over time. The people that voted for Trump tend to focus more on globalization, right? They're worried that the Chinese are stealing all the jobs.
Right.
But actually, technology has played a bigger role. I mean,
technology is stealing
much more
technology is stealing the roles. What's with China then? What's the impact on China?
Well, what's happening with China is that a lot of the jobs did go to China, but now they're just going to disappear there because the Chinese are now bringing the robots into their factories as well. So
right, because the Chinese have to compete, right? The Chinese have to compete with America. So if American labor goes
the
to
Chinese
robots,
have to compete. They have to compete with with
robots.
The possibility that the factories could come back to the United States and be automated. They're competing with that. And they're also competing with even lower wage workers in Indonesia and Vietnam and countries like that. So they're forced to then bring the automation into their factories because they don't want to lose those factories. But ultimately they're going to face the same problem is that the factories are going to be there, but there are going to be far fewer jobs.
Right. So once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki of the Rich Dad Radio Show. When we come back, we'll be discussing: is your job safe? Are you secure? Let's say, for instance, you have family members or business partners or friends. Please download this program and listen to it, friends and family, and discuss, and you'll pick up whole new distinctions. So our guest today is Martin Ford. We had him on before, but I hadn't read his book. Then after I talked to him, he was so impressive because he's a techie guy, and I'm not a techie guy. And his book, The Rise of Robots, I went, oh, my God. It's really alarming what he's saying. Better wake up here. Any comments, Kim?
Yes, well, I mean, this is a fascinating subject because I'd like to ask Martin at this point. We talk about all the jobs that are going to be lost to technology and to robotics and to artificial intelligence. Will new jobs be created because of this technology?
Yeah, they will. I mean, that's the way it's always worked. We've seen jobs destroyed and we've seen jobs created. And in the past, the number of jobs that have been created have kind of been at least as many as those have been destroyed. And also they've been, in many cases, better jobs, and they've still been jobs that regular people can do. What I'm concerned about with the way this technology is moving is that that's going to change in the future. And there still will be jobs created, but not as many as are destroyed. In other words, the destruction is going to be bigger than the creation. And the other thing that is likely, I think, to happen is that the kinds of jobs created are probably going to be, very sophisticated. They're going to be the kinds of jobs that really require lots of education, maybe technical training, maybe lots of intellectual capability. And so they may be jobs that, the typical person is really not going to be well equipped to move into. So, for example, if you're driving a taxi or working at McDonald's and you lose your job, then there may be another job out there if you're lucky, but that job really may require lots and lots of training, college and graduate degrees and all of that. And so it will be really, really hard for you to move into that job. So there could be simply not enough jobs to go around, and also what you would call a skill mismatch in terms of the skills that typical people have and the kinds of skills that you need to move in that job. And I think that, that eventually that's going to create a real problem for us. Right.
So we have this huge gap between the rich and everybody else, including the middle class. And as I said earlier, everybody knows the poor are toast. Nobody's trying to save the poor anymore. It's the middle class. So is it possible for you, Martin, to give us a demographic snapshot profile of a middle-class individual with a college degree and all this to have a good job? How might this affect them?
I mean, the problem with this person is that typically the middle class person, they probably got a knowledge job. Good chance they've got a college degree in today's world, and they're doing some kind of middle management or knowledge-based jobs, and a tremendous amount of that is going to be susceptible to automation. So we're going to see this continue to kind of erode the middle class. I mean, we've already seen the working class get hit hard, right? It used to have good, solid. Used to have middle class people that worked in factories, good, solid working class jobs, and had really access to a middle class income. And we know that has largely eroded now. And nowadays, you pretty much got to have a university, college degree in order to have a chance to enter the middle class. The advances that we see make it clear that a lot of those jobs are going to disappear too. And that's, the leading edge of that is the college student that comes out today and is ending up working at Starbucks, because the entry-level jobs that lead to that middle class path are already beginning to evaporate.
So
and there aren't enough to go around for the new college grads.
So that's my question to you. Kim and I were in South Carolina. We're talking to this woman. She's lower working class, hardworking single mom, and she's so excited. She's busting her back and all this, and she's got two to three jobs, and her kids have student loan debt, and she's putting them through college. And I asked them what her children were learning, and they were non-specific. They were just kind of
arts, liberal arts,
and stuff that just get you a college degree. Yeah. And I didn't know what to say to her except, "Hey, good job." But I really wanted to say, your kid might be in trouble. What would you say? What would you have said to her if she was receptive to hearing it?
In terms of advice that I can give to people, the only thing I can say is that you want to make sure that you're not doing something that is on some level routine and repetitive. And this is true whether it's your job you're doing right now or whether your children are going to school to learn something. So there are certain areas that are more promising. One is healthcare. If you're, for example, a nurse, someone that really works with patients and requires lots of mobility and dexterity and is running around the hospital all the time. And for us to build a robot that can do what a nurse does is still science fiction. So that's not something that's going to happen soon. So that's, being a nurse is a pretty safe job for the foreseeable future. So, you want to focus on areas like that really are not routine and repetitive, and especially that require either a very deep interaction with other people, like a caring type relationship you might see with a nurse, or you should be doing something creative. You should be generating new ideas.
So does this
not just sitting in front of a computer doing the same thing again and again.
Right. So is this going to open the door, do you think, for a more entrepreneurial environment, more people starting their own businesses, small businesses?
Well, that's happening already out of necessity, right? People lose other opportunities, and then they do entrepreneurial things, which is great. The problem is that, most new businesses fail by, statistically, and a lot of times people are really going to have a tough time generating a middle class income from that. So I think that's like a partial solution. So there are really kind of two ways to think of this. One is, what should I do? What should my kids do to stay safe? But then there's another very important question, which is how are we going to adapt to this as a society? And I think that, we're going to have to recognize that not everyone is going to succeed in getting lucky and finding a job that the robots can't do, right? There's going to be a big impact on society. We've got to figure out what to do about that. And that's the reason in the book I talk about maybe someday having a guaranteed income, minimal income at least.
Yeah, that's coming up the next next segment after this. But I think what was really frightening or eye-opening for me was your thing on artificial intelligence, AI, that how fast a robot can, a robot can outlearn you. Could you explain that? It takes me such a long time to learn something, but a robot can sit there and do it faster, quicker, longer, right?
That's right. The biggest thing that's happening in artificial intelligence right now is machine learning. And this is just about smart algorithms that look at data and they can learn. And they can learn to do all kinds of things. The most dramatic example of that we saw was Google's DeepMind. They built a system to play the ancient Asian game of Go, which is, not everyone is familiar with that, but it's a game that
it's like checkers.
Is dramatically more sophisticated than chess. The way computers won at chess, and right now, computers can beat just about any chess player in the world. Chess has fallen to the machines. But the way computers did that is that they just used raw computing power to to look ahead and figure out all the possible moves ahead, and then to sort of throw raw computation at it. That can't be done with the game of Go. I mean, the game is too sophisticated for that. There are too many potential moves that you could make, and so Google actually built a machine that kind of works like the human brain and learned to play the game of Go, and then became so good at it that it could beat the best player in the world.
And that's why I brought it up.
Of what this technology can do.
Because what you're talking about, reason I asked you that question is about school, education, and all this. But there are many people I meet, they're so cocky and arrogant, so I'm really smart. And what I loved about the rise of robots, where you're saying the robots are smarter than you now.
Right. I mean, in specific areas, that's becoming true. I mean, for example, there are already robots that can fly airplanes, right? We have automatic pilots that can land and take off planes and fly the planes and so forth. So in specific areas, it's already true that machines are beginning to exceed human capability. And the thing is that most jobs are specific, right? Most people are not jacks of all trades. They go to work and they do specific things, and artificial intelligence and automation is going to get better at doing those specific things. I mean, we still are certainly not at the point where computers are generally as intelligent as people, although people think that will happen, and it might happen in, say, 50 years. And if that does happen, then that's like a whole other order of magnitude to all of this.
And isn't there another level of military where they're using robotics and robots in the military to replace soldiers?
Right, and that's happening already. There's a big debate over whether we should eventually allow robots to autonomously shoot people. Many people find that to be very, very disturbing, and so for example, there's a proposal in the United Nations to ban those kind of autonomous weapons in the way that chemical weapons have been banned, for example, because it is a scary scenario, right?
Depending on what hands it gets in. Robots are going to go around
deciding all on their own to shoot people.
Well, the drones are already doing that, except a human pushes the trigger.
Right. The drones right now have got a human person some of them are highly autonomous in terms of flying around,
right.
But in terms of actually making the decision to open fire, there's always a person in the loop. And so there's a huge debate about that right now. One of the problems is that in the future on the battlefield, things may move so fast that eventually it will be impossible to have a person always making that decision, because that would slow the whole thing down. And, so whoever makes the first jump into building a fully autonomous robot is going to have an advantage. And by some accounts, the Russians are already, doing that or working with it.
So once again, Martin, thank you very much. Appreciate it. His website is econfuture.wordpress.com. Martin Ford's book, The Rise of Robots. But the big question is, how safe is your job or your kid's job? Or is the idea of going to school to get a job as obsolete, as 8-track CDs, whatever they are? So anyway, it's been a fascinating morning so far. And I want to thank Martin Ford again for his contribution. Any comments, Kim?
No, I think it was a great contribution and very eye-opening, especially in talking about the future. And our next guest is going to piggyback on what one of the consequences, probably one of the biggest consequences that this whole robotic movement is possibly going to have on not just the U.S. but on the globe, on the world.
It's the idea of job security, and our guest today for the third part of the program is Oren Cass. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He was domestic policy director of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, 2011 and 2012. So welcome to the program, Oren.
Welcome, Oren.
Thank you for having me.
Your specialty is a thing called basic income, or, basic, everybody gets a paycheck. Everybody gets trophies today. Now you get a paycheck whether you work or not.
Well, that's right. And I think it's important actually not to call it a paycheck, of course, because you're not getting paid for anything.
Right.
And that has a lot of consequences. But the idea that's become very popular is that we look at how much we spend on especially programs for the poor already, and you say, gosh, especially in developed countries like the U.S., if you just take all that money and instead we mail it to everybody, then we wouldn't have to worry about anybody being poor anymore. And it turns out there are a lot of problems with that. Some is just the math doesn't add up. We don't actually have enough money to do it. But I think even more important is the social consequence, because right now it's very important to our society that, you are expected to provide for yourself and your family if you can. And if we go the direction of a universal basic income, we're saying that's not true anymore. It's actually the government's responsibility to provide for you and your family. And if you're working, it's because you want to earn even more money, but not because you're the provider.
So how much progress and how much of this idea, it started coming around the UBI around the 60s when somebody floated the idea that pretty soon workers would be obsolete. How real is that getting now? Or, is it realistic? It's something to be concerned about.
Well, I think the point you make is exactly right, which is people were talking about workers becoming obsolete 50 years ago, and obviously that hasn't happened. Even if you look at just in the United States since the dot-com boom and the Internet, we've added about 25 million new jobs. And in fact, at every stage in human history, new innovation, new technologies, they don't remove the need for jobs at all. They make us more productive. They allow us to do a lot more things with a lot less work. But people will always find productive things to do, and in a capitalist economy in particular, other people will always have an incentive to help each other find productive things to do. And so, I at least think that's the direction we should go. We should focus on setting up a system that encourages people to go find productive work, not one that says, "Oh, never mind, let's not worry so much about this work thing."
So why even discuss UBI, universal basic income, if people naturally, because that's not my experience. I know a lot of people who don't work. They're quite happy to stay at home.
Well, I think there are certainly lots of situations in which people don't work. And certainly I think the ideal amount of work that you'd want somebody to do, doesn't mean having to work 3 jobs and the overnight shift. And to the extent that we can make sure that people are well compensated for doing a more reasonable amount of work, that would be terrific. But most people do work, and most people who don't work are either in a family with somebody who is working, or they have already worked and earned money that they're now living off of. There are very few people who just don't work and live off of money that they're given. And to the extent that happens, first of all, we tend to look down on it, and second of all, we tend to find out that the consequences aren't very good. I mean, whether you're talking about trust fund kids or celebrities or people just living off of welfare checks for whatever reason, though that's certainly increasingly hard to do. Very few of us aspire to that. And
so why even discuss UBI, universal basic income, if people want to work and there's plenty of jobs and they're getting along? Why?
The discussion comes from a few different directions. It's actually a very interesting coalition. One group that really wants to discuss it is people from the far left of the political spectrum who don't like work, who think, that the system that requires people to work to earn money is oppressive in various ways, and that we should prefer a system, essentially moving in a socialist direction where nobody feels like they need to work. So that's one group supporting it. Then a second group you have supporting it is actually people much further to the right who are libertarians, who hate the welfare state, who hate the huge proliferation of government programs that we have that we know don't work well. Just in the U.S., we spend more than $1 trillion a year on anti-poverty programs, enough to mail every poor family a check that would bring them out of poverty. And then the third, and I should just mention, the third group is I think, like your earlier guest, the kind of the robots group, who really believe that technology is going to make work obsolete, and so we'd better have an alternative available.
So, Oren, let me ask you that with technology, with artificial intelligence, what kind of impact do you see that having on future jobs and future industry?
Well, I think it will certainly cause a lot of changes. I think one important thing to keep in mind is that, these changes tend to happen very slowly. If you look at productivity growth in the U.S., for instance, right now it's incredibly low. Even when it's going very well, it's 3, maybe 4% a year. So, the rate at which new technologies become adopted, become deployed, become standard is over the course of decades at a minimum. And right now we're really starting from zero. I mean, I don't know if you've tried using Siri or gotten one of those Google Home or Alexa devices and tried to ask it something. We're just not there yet, frankly. And so certainly there will be more and more things that technology can help us do, but a lot of what we've always seen, and which I think we'll continue to see, is that technology actually becomes something that makes people more productive, not that replaces people. Even in factories, when you use automation technology, that doesn't mean you don't need people working in the factory. It means you can have fewer people working in the factory, and each one can be more productive. So if we get the policy right, and we get people's expectations right, we can actually create a system where technology makes people's jobs better, means everyone can attain a higher level of income, and everyone can lead a better life, but not that somehow people are going to become obsolete and not an important part of the economy.
That's an interesting point of view, because I grew up in Hawaii, and the little town I grew up in was a sugar plantation town. And when the sugar plantation moved out in 1994, the town collapsed. And the people then went criminal. Most of my classmates are in tropical agriculture today, called marijuana. So they're making a lot of money in all this, but they have to do it outside the law. So I see things changing a little bit more rapidly. And the reason I want you on this program, so you don't seem that concerned or the need to have a universal basic income, except just to make the left people happier. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think the sugar plantation example is actually a really important one, and it's a debate that we're seeing playing out, especially after Trump's win. You hear a lot about the Rust Belt and what's happening with factories. And people say, well, are we actually losing the jobs because of trade, or are we losing them because of automation? And it kind of all gets blended together,
right?
But it's two completely different things.
Right.
If we lose jobs because of trade, and I don't know the details of the sugar plantation, but if you just stop the productive activity in an area, then the community loses. Then there's nothing left to do. If you bring new technology in, so the factory is still there, it's still producing, it's probably producing even more than it did before, but with fewer people, that can be a great thing for the community, because the community still has that productive capacity. It's still earning the income. And if fewer of the people are working in the factory or on the plantation, and more of them are working in other local services, that can be a perfectly healthy economy. But the point is that you're still doing the production is still happening there. So if you have the production there, it can still work.
And is it a good solution for replacing the welfare system?
Well, I think that's a great question, Kim, because so with respect to the robot rationale, I think the answer is it's silly to be talking about a basic income. If the robots ever do take all the jobs, let's talk about it then. But we don't have to talk about it in advance. With respect to kind of the more standard poverty rationale that says this would be better than the way we do the welfare state now, the problem is that the math just doesn't add up.
So is that
right now?
Is that the primary reason? Is not so much about unemployment, but a better system of welfare?
Yeah, well, again, it depends who you talk to. If you talk to some of the libertarians who support it, this is what they will say, is that we would much rather have everyone working and earning money, but we also have to be realistic. We recognize that our society has committed to helping people whether or not they work. The easiest way to do that is with a basic income.
Well, Martin Ford, in his book, The Rise of Robots, Martin Ford makes a case for McDonald's. Everybody talks about hamburger flippers. He says that robots will replace 40% of the fast food workers.
Fast food is an area where I think you're likely to see automation in the coming years. But even if you say we're going to replace 40% of the workers with these robots, you have to figure that that's going to take a large number of years. Let's say it takes 10 years to actually roll that out, which would be a very aggressive assumption. You're actually only turning over 4% of your workforce a year if you do that. And you're also creating jobs as you eliminate jobs. So you might not need hamburger flippers, but now you need someone who knows how to actually build and maintain those machines. So the net change in employment isn't necessarily that large. Who is employed could change a lot. If you say the types of people who can maintain and build that equipment are very different from the people who can flip hamburgers, then you have an interesting policy question, which is how do we make sure that the jobs that are available in the economy line up with the kind of work people know how to do.
So that's it.
So then you also have to talk about education and training. and trade and immigration. There are a huge number of policy areas that bear on this question, but none of it comes out to an answer that we don't need, that we can't have jobs for people.
Okay.
And so then it really becomes a more philosophical question of whether you want jobs for people. You know, I think the outlook that you espouse, and certainly in your wonderful book as well, is, you know, that work is an important part of a lot of things beyond just the paycheck you might receive at a moment in time.
Right.
And so that's really the philosophical debate underlying this is, do we want to keep work as a positive central part of our society or not?
Right.
If we do, then basic income's not the right route.
You know, it's my point of view, and everybody has a different point of view. We've had Oren Cass on, who has a different point of view than I share. And then we had Martin Ford, the author of the book, The Rise of Robots. And he sees unemployment rising. Oren Cass does not. He thinks people can just adapt to higher technology. I, for one, don't think I could because I'm not that smart technologically. Any comments, Kim?
One thing that Martin Ford is saying, that the exponential change that's coming through technology is going to be coming at us so fast, so quickly, that it's going to be upon us before we even know it.
It's already here.
Yeah, so it's hard to look back and the way we did it in the past was this. May not, as many of our guests have said, you know, the next 20 years are not going to look anything like the past 20 years. So we're just going to have to watch it and pay attention and be prepared.
There's one more thing I'll point out is that people cannot see this change. It's invisible. This change could just be a software program. I've never seen a software program yet, but it affects, you know, when I touch my car, the car door opens automatically. I don't see that, but something's operating these systems. So the information age is the invisible age. And that's what makes it hard. And Martin Ford covers it in his book, The Rise of Robots. He says, the trouble with most academics and economists, they're trying to determine the future from the past. But the future is completely different today because we're no longer industrial age. We're now information age. And so I've been reading more and more and more, like my friend Jim Rickards and all this. He says some of the worst people as academics who live in ivory towers and economists is that they think they have a crystal ball, but they're really obsolete people. So more and more, please pay attention, and your guess is as good as mine. So you can submit your questions to Ask Robert at richdadradio.com. And once again, thanks to Oren Cass and Martin Ford. First question, Melissa.
Our first question today comes from Angelo in Zurich, Switzerland. Favorite book, Cash Flow Quadrant. It says a lot of jobs will be taken away because of automation and or robots. Do you expect a civil war in the near future because of this?
I don't know if it's civil war, but I think it's civil unrest. There's a very big difference. And we already see it right now. You know, with these apps and all that, people get, I don't know, I'm not a tech guy. You can create a crowd in an instant. You don't have to dial anybody. You just get on your cell phone and the crowd appears. Right, Kim?
That's right. That's all it takes.
So you get a couple of these crowds appearing and they just build mass. It's not going to take much. I remember they stopped this one kid. He was protesting Trump and all this, and he was out there screaming and yelling. And I said, well, "What do you object to with President Trump?" He says, "I don't know, but I'm just objecting." You know, the kid had no idea. And the women's march, Kim, what did you see?
Oh, the Women's March. A lot of women were up there going, you know, we're marching for civil rights. We're marching for women's rights. We're marching for, we don't want Roe versus Wade turned. They were marching for all sorts of things, but I don't know that there was any cohesiveness to it. But here's the one thing I do want to say on civil unrest. I think civil unrest is very possible, and the robotics may play a piece of it. But there's also the whole economic piece. People don't have jobs. They're not able to take care of their families. They're upset. There's a lot of ways that civil unrest can take form.
And you look at former President Obama's hometown. He comes from Hawaii, but Chicago. You know, Chicago is coming apart. They're shooting and killing each other like crazy right now. So what's going on? I don't know. But there's a lot of discontent in the air. The New York Times last weekend had an article about these Indians, I think it told Indian tribes, who are now kicking out people who are not Indian enough. You're not Indian enough now. What is? I don't know what's going on out there. So they're kicking out fellow members of the tribes, and they've been brothers and sisters of the same tribe for all their lives. But there's so much discontent in the world today. It's kind of worrying.
Well, one side note, Angelo's from Zurich, Switzerland, and we've been talking about universal basic income, UBI. And not long ago, Switzerland actually put to vote whether UBI should be implemented in Switzerland. They were going to pay everybody 2,500 Swiss francs a month, and it got voted down quite by a large margin. So it's out there and it's happening. Interesting that he's from Switzerland.
Yeah, I think it'll depend upon the country. There's certain countries, and we all know what countries they are. You gave everybody 2,500 francs a month, they'd all vote yes.
There's a few of them out there.
Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Emil in San Francisco. Favorite book, Midas Touch. I've read Martin Ford's book and have been watching the emergence of technology and robots on the workforce. The problem is when I try to talk to my family about preparing now for what's coming, they don't believe what I'm saying. How do you get people to wake up and pay attention to the fact that things will be very different sooner rather than later?
Well, that's why we have all of our programs archived at richdadradio.com. Simply go to richdadradio.com, pull up this broadcast, get it, make it nice and easy, and tell them you want to sit down and listen to it, and then they can have a discussion over dinner or a drink or whatever it is. But I think it's just about awareness. Please listen to this, okay? We've gone through 4 phases of humanity. One was the hunter-gatherer, which is the caveman. Second was the agrarian age, was the farmer. Third was the industrial age, Henry Ford and factories. And now is the information age. The trouble with technology in the information age is invisible. You cannot see it. You cannot see what's wiping your job out. So everything is invisible today. And that's why I was a student of Dr. R. Buckminster Fuller. And he says we're entering the age of the great invisible. And that's why we have to depend more on our intuition more than information. So there's a very wise thing about going into the invisible right now. Oren Cass wasn't too concerned about unemployment. Martin Ford is. I am. Kim is. But you have to come up with your decision. And I think Oren did a great job of explaining the distinctions. It's not economic, it's political. It's which way you see. If you're a communist, obviously you want a universal income. If you're a capitalist, you may not. Who knows? But it's not about what's really going on.
And I would just say to Emil, family is often the toughest people to convince of anything that you might say. So I just want to acknowledge you for reading, for studying, for looking at what is coming and what we do think is coming. Make your own decisions, but you do what you need to do. Don't be too concerned about having to convince your family because you may never do that.
And thanks for listening to the Rich Dad Radio program, by the way. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Maddie in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Do you feel it's more important in these times to learn more about asset class investing, or is my time better spent going back to school to learn how to become a computer coder?
Well, that's a great idea. If I thought I could compute code or code compute, I'd probably go do that. But I think I'm much better off, given my age and my own personal demographics, to stay with money and finance. It's a lot simpler to me. Any comments?
That's, number one, going back to school is always an issue here because things again are changing so fast. So computer coder, I have no idea what computer coder would be like in a week from now. It might be all different. So I don't know how to even address that. Going into the world of technology, it feels like you have to be in it like right now to see all the changes that are coming every single day. So I can't answer that question. But
Kim and I are in real estate every single day.
I like real estate.
And it's somebody, I don't care what cell phone you're carrying, whether Android or Apple, but you have to have a roof over your head, which is why I like real estate. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Brandon in New York. Favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Do you think robots will have a personality or a spirit? What will business look like without spirit or the human element?
I have no idea. Any comments on that, Kim?
This could be the rise of entrepreneurial environment for people to start their own businesses. You start a business because there's a problem you want to solve. You start a business because you have a passion about something that you want to bring to the world. And that is the human element. That's a human spirit. So I'm not too concerned about what other businesses might look like right now. I would say if you're interested in business, now might be a good time to start your own business.
Right now, I'd be looking for a business that hired robots more than human beings. I'd be like, how can I do that? That would be my question, are the robots happy today? The other thing that Martin Ford talks about is that Henry Ford Jr. and this guy who ran the labor unions were walking around the Ford plant. And, Henry Ford Sr. was a guy that doubled wages. So he doubled his employees' wages at Ford from $2.50 to $5. And the reason he did that, this is the original Henry Ford, was so his workers could afford to buy the car. So just recently, the next Henry Ford Jr. or Sr. III was walking the labor union guy through. He says, look at all these robots. And the labor union guy said, do robots buy cars? See, that's the question. And what Martin Ford's talking about is this: when robots take over, just a computer program or an actual machine, it'll change the world because they work 24/7. They don't need health care. They don't need dental care. They don't need vacation. They don't need maternity leave. Nothing.